Good morning, 7th graders. Hope you're doing well today. We are continuing the book we started yesterday, Refugee by Alan Gratz. If you didn't listen in, check those links that you're receiving from your collegiate leaders and make sure you read yesterday and then follow along today as we continue the story. Yesterday, we were introduced to the main character of our book, Joseph, whose family is facing challenges and uncertainty. He is being forced, he and his family are being forced to leave their home and leave their country immediately. And this story is set in Germany during the reign of Adolf Hitler. So we are now on page 7 for those of you who are following along. This is where we're starting today. Page 7, title of the chapter is Isabel. Just outside Havana, Cuba, 1994. It took only 2 tries to get the scrawny calico kitten to come out from under the pink cinder block house and eat from Isabel Fernandez's hand. The cat was hungry, just like everyone else in Cuba, and its belly quickly won out over its fear. The cat was so tiny it could only nibble at the beans. Its tummy purred like an outboard motor, and it butted its head against Isabel's hand in between bites. "You're not much to look at, are you, kitty?" Isabel said. Its fur was scraggly and dull, and Isabel could feel the cat's bones through its skin. The kitten wasn't too different from her, Isabel realized. Thin, hungry, and in need of a bath. Isabel was 11 years old and all lanky arms and legs. Her brown face was splotchy with freckles, and her thick black hair was cut short for summer and pulled back behind her ears. She was barefoot like always and wore a tank top and shorts. The kitten gobbled up the last of the beans and mewed pitifully. Isabel wished she had something else to give it, but this food was already more than she could spare. Her lunch hadn't been much bigger than the cat's. Just a few beans and a small pile of white rice. There had been rationing and food coupons, books back when Isabel was little. But a few years ago, in 1989, the Soviet Union had fallen and Cuba had hit rock bottom. Cuba was a communist country, like Russia had been. And for decades, the Soviets had been buying Cuba's sugar for 11 times the price and sending the little island food and gasoline and medicine for free. But when the Soviet Union went away, so did all their support. Most of the farms in Cuba grew only sugarcane. With no one to overpay for it, the cane fields dried up, the sugar refineries closed, and people lost their jobs. Without Russia's gas, they couldn't run the tractors to change the fields over to food. And without the extra food, the Cuban people began to starve. All the cows and pigs and sheep had been slaughtered and eaten. People had even broken into the Havana Zoo and eaten the animals. And cats like this little kitten had ended up on dinner tables. But nobody was going to eat this cat. "You'll just be our little secret," Isabel whispered. "Hey, Isabel," Ivan said, making her jump. The cat skittered away underneath the house. Ivan was a year older than Isabel and lived next door. He and Isabel had been friends as long as she could remember. Ivan was lighter skinned than Isabel, with curly dark hair. He wore sandals, shorts, a short sleeve button-down shirt, and a cap with a fancy letter I on it. The logo of the Havana baseball team, the Industrials. He wanted to be a professional baseball player when he grew up, and he was good enough that it wasn't a crazy dream. Ivan plopped to the dusty ground beside Isabel. "Look," I found a bit of dead fish on the beach for the cat. Isabel recoiled at the smell, but the kitten came running back, eating greedily from Ivan's hand. She needs a name, Ivan said. Ivan gave names to everything, the stray dogs who wandered the town, his bicycle, even his baseball glove. How about Jorge or Javier or Lazaro? Those are all boy names, Isabel said. Yes, but they are all players for the Lions, and she's a little lion. The Lions was the nickname of the Industrials, or Industriales. Ivan, his father called from next door, I need your help in the shed. Ivan climbed to his feet. I have to go. We're building a doghouse, he said before sprinting away. Isabel shook her head. Ivan thought he was being sneaky, but Isabel knew exactly what he and his father were building in their shed, and it wasn't a doghouse. It was a boat to sail to the United States. Isabel was worried the Castillos were going to get caught. Fidel Castro, the man who ruled Cuba as president and prime minister, wouldn't allow anyone to leave the country, especially not to go to the United States. El Norte, as Cubans called it, the North. If you were caught trying to leave for El Norte by boat, Castro would throw you in jail. Isabel knew that because her own father had tried and had been thrown in jail for a year. Isabel noticed her father and grandfather heading down the road toward the city to stand in line for food. She put the little kitten back under her house and ran inside for her trumpet. Isabel loved tagging along on trips into Havana to stand on a street corner and play her trumpet for pesos. She never did make much, not because she wasn't good. As her mother liked to say, Isabel could play the storm clouds from the sky. People often stopped to listen to her and clap and tap their feet, but the only people who could afford to give her pesos were the tourists, visitors from Canada or Europe or Mexico. Ever since the Soviet Union had collapsed, the only currency most Cubans had were the booklets you got stamped when you went to pick up your food rations from the store. And food ration booklets were pretty worthless anyway. There wasn't enough food to go around, whether you had a booklet or not. Isabel caught up with her father and grandfather, then parted ways with them on the Malcion, the broad road that curved along the seawall on Havana Harbor. On one side of the road were blocks of green and yellow and pink and baby blue homes and shops. The paint was peeling, and the buildings were old and weathered, but they still looked grand to Isabel. She stood on the wide promenade where it seemed all of Havana was on display. Mothers carried babies in slings, couples kissed under palm trees. Buskers played rumbas on guitars and drums. Boys took turns diving into the sea. Tourists took pictures. It was Isabel's favorite place in the whole city. Isabel tossed an old ball cap on the ground on the off chance that one of the tourists actually had a peso to spare. She lifted the trumpet to her lips. As she blew, her fingers tapped out the notes she knew by heart. It was a salsa tune she liked to play, but this time she listened past the music, past the noise of the cars and trucks on the Malcion, past the people talking as they walked by, past the crash of the waves against the seawall behind her. Isabel was listening for the clave underneath the music, the mysterious hidden beat inside Cuban music that everybody seemed to hear, except her. An irregular rhythm that lay over the top of the regular beat, like a heartbeat beneath the skin. Try as she might, she had never heard it, never felt it. She listened now intently, trying to hear the heartbeat of Cuba in her own music. What she heard instead was the sound of breaking glass. Mahmood, Aleppo, Syria, 2015. Mahmoud Bashara was invisible, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Being invisible was how he survived. He wasn't literally invisible. If you really looked at Mahmoud, got a glimpse under the hoodie he kept pulled down over his face, you would see a 12-year-old boy with a long, strong nose, thick black eyebrows, and short cropped black hair. He was stocky, his shoulders wide and muscular despite the food shortages. But Mahmoud did everything he could to hide his size and his face, to stay under the radar. Random death from a fighter's jet missile or a soldier's rocket launcher might come at any moment when you least expected it. To walk around getting noticed by the Syrian army or the rebels fighting them was just inviting trouble. Mahmoud sat in the middle row of desks in his classroom where the teacher wouldn't call on him. The desks were wide enough for 3 students at each, and Mahmoud sat between 2 other boys named Ahmed and Nahal. Ahmed and Nahal weren't his friends. Mahmoud didn't have any friends. It was easier to stay invisible that way. One of the teachers walked up and down the hall ringing a handbell. Mahmoud collected his backpack and went to find his little brother, Khalid. Khalid was 10 years old and 2 grades below Mahmoud in school. He too wore his black hair cropped short, but he looked more like their mother, with narrower shoulders, thinner eyebrows, a flatter nose, and bigger ears. His teeth looked too big for his head, and when he smiled, he looked like a cartoon squirrel. Not that Khalid smiled much anymore. Mahmoud couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his brother laugh or cry or show any emotion whatsoever. The war had made Mahmoud nervous, twitchy, paranoid. It had made his little brother a robot. Even though their apartment wasn't far away, Mahmoud led Khalid on a different route home every day. Sometimes it was the back alleys. There could be fighters in the streets who were always targets for the opposition. Bombed out buildings were good too. Mahmoud and Khalid would disappear among the heaps of twisted metal and broken cement, and there were no walls to fall on them if an artillery shell went whizzing overhead. If a plane dropped a barrel bomb, though, you needed walls. Barrel bombs were filled with nails and scrap metal, and if you didn't have a wall to duck behind, you'd be shredded to pieces. It hadn't always been this way. Just 4 years ago, their home city of Aleppo had been the biggest, brightest, most modern city in Syria, a crown jewel of the Middle East. Mahmoud remembered neon malls, glittering skyscrapers, soccer stadiums, movie theaters, museums. Aleppo had history too, a long history. The old city at the heart of Aleppo was built in the 12th century, and people had lived in the area as early as 8,000 years ago. Aleppo had been an amazing city to grow up in until 2011 when the Arab Spring came to Syria. They didn't call it that then. Nobody knew a wave of revolutions would sweep through the Middle East, toppling governments and overthrowing dictators and starting civil wars. All they knew from images on TV and posts on Facebook and Twitter was that people in Tunisia and Libya and Yemen were rioting in the streets, and as each country stood up and said enough, so did the next one and the next one, until at last the Arab Spring came to Syria. But Syrians knew protesting in the streets was dangerous. Syria was ruled by Bashar al-Assad, who had twice been elected president when no one was allowed to run against him. Assad made people who didn't like him disappear forever. Everyone was afraid of what he would do if the Arab Spring swept through Syria. There was an old Arabic proverb that said, "Close the door that brings the wind and relax." And that's exactly what they did. While the rest of the Middle East was rioting, Syrians stayed inside and locked their doors and waited to see what would happen next. But they didn't close the door tight enough. A man in Damascus, the capital of Syria, was imprisoned for speaking out against Assad. Some kids in Dara, a city in southern Syria, were arrested and abused by the police for writing anti-Assad slogans on walls. And then the whole country seemed to go crazy all at once. Tens of thousands of people poured into the streets demanding the release of political prisoners and more freedom for everyone. Within a month, Assad had turned his tanks and soldiers and bombers on the protesters, on his own people. And ever since then, all Mahmood and Khalid and anyone else in Syria had known was war. Mahmood and Khalid turned down a different rubble-strewn alley than the day before and stopped dead. Just ahead of them, two boys had another boy up against what was left of a wall, about to take the bag of bread he carried. Mahmood pulled Khalid behind a burned-out car, his heart racing. Incidents like this were common in Aleppo lately. It was getting harder and harder to get food in the city, but for Mahmood, this scene brought back memories of another time, just after the war had begun. Mahmood had been going to meet his best friend, Khalid, down a side street just like this one. Down a side street just like this one, Mahmood found Khalid getting beaten up by two older boys. Khalid was a Shia Muslim in a country of mostly Sunni Muslims. Khalid was clever, smart, always quick to raise his hand in class and always with the right answer. He and Mahmood had known each other for years, and even though Mahmood was Sunni and Khalid was Shia, that had never mattered to them. They liked to spend their afternoons and weekends reading comic books and watching superhero movies and playing video games. But right then, Khalid had been curled into a ball on the ground, his hands around his head while the older boys kicked him. "Not so smart now, are you, pig?" one of them had said. "Shia should know their place. This is Syria, not Iran." Mahmood had bristled. The difference between Sunnis and Shiites was an excuse. These boys had just wanted to beat someone up. With a battle cry that would have made Wolverine proud, Mahmood had launched himself at Khalid's attackers, and he had been beaten up as badly as Khalid. From that day forward, Mahmood and Khalid were marked. The two older boys became Mahmood's and Khalid's only personal bullies, delivering repeated beatdowns between classes and after school. That's when Mahmood and Khalid had learned how valuable it was to be invisible. Mahmood stayed in the classroom all day, never going to the bathroom or the playground. Khalid never answered another question in class, not even when the teacher called on him directly. If the bullies didn't notice you, they didn't hit you. That's when Mahmood had realized that together he and Khalid were bigger targets. Alone, it was easier to be invisible. It was nothing they ever said to each other, just something they each came to understand. And within a year, they had drifted apart, not even speaking to each other as they passed in the hall. A year after that, Khalil had died in an airstrike anyway. It was better not to have friends in Syria in 2015. Mahmood watched as these two boys attacked the boy with the bread, a boy he didn't even know. He felt the stirrings of indignation, of anger, of sympathy. His breath came quick and deep, and his hands clenched into fists. "I should do something," he whispered. But he knew better. Head down, hoodie up, eyes on the ground. The trick was to be invisible, blend in, disappear. Mahmood took his younger brother by the hand, turned around, and found a different way home. I'm going to stop there today. We're on page 17. We finished that. And tomorrow, we're going to go back to Joseph in Germany. Please make sure you're reading along each day. And I hope you have a really good rest of your day. Take care of yourself and stay safe. See you tomorrow. Thank you, champions.